121. Encounter with Hermione Hogwarts. In the dormitory, the thick bed curtain was yanked open from the inside. After changing into Slytherin's plain robe, Eno pushed the dormitory door and slipped out into the castle grounds. The discoveries he'd made recently had filled him with an almost guilty delight, a joy he couldn't share. He wanted to be alone, to splash in the black lake and unwind. As a black swan, being in the water felt right. With a small, private smile, Eno made his way to the lake. Hogwarts was full of students, and the castle itself was enormous. The grounds beyond were even more vast. The black lake alone seemed endless. By the covered bridge, he crouched behind a large stone. On the other side, a swan with feathers that shimmered faintly blue stepped forward. Plop. It launched itself into the water with no pretensions and paddled gently, sending rings across the surface. The swan cut toward the center, graceful and unhurried. Sunlight poured over the lake. Eno floated on the surface and closed his eyes, savoring the easy buoyancy and the hush that came with it. For the first time in a while, he let all his burdens fall away. Whether it was the mutated flame charm or the White Witch's ice magic, if he paced himself, he could master them. He might not become a legendary wizard overnight, but steady study could make him a top-tier practitioner, someone like Snape or McGonagall. And if he could learn the secrets of that time reversal book, the future looked as calm and open as the lake before him. Time, it seemed, had a way of hurrying when pleasure was involved. Unnoticed, the sky had been painted warm orange by the setting sun. Clouds drifted, throwing their shadows over the water. A soft breeze carried the distant laughter of students from the castle. On the gravel path outside the castle, Eno was humming a country song as he walked toward the lights. "Eno!" A familiar voice called from behind. He turned to see Hermione and the others on the lawn, hurrying toward him. "Good evening, Hermione. Mr. Potter." "Mr. Weasley," he said, smiling. He felt lighter now, and no longer bothered by the story's complications. He wouldn't put distance between himself and Harry or Ron for the sake of appearances. It was pointless, and he'd grown beyond it. Hermione looked unexpectedly pleased. Earlier in Hagrid's hut, she, Harry, and Ron had been talking about Lockhart's strange behavior. When things had felt stuck, Hermione had somehow found herself thinking of Eno. He was sensible, knowledgeable, gentle. "Eno, are you free? We found something huge." She hurried toward him. Harry and Ron exchanged looks and followed close behind. Harry's impression of Eno was not bad. Eno had done a fortune-telling that had in the end proved useful, while Ron was openly grateful. Whatever bias he'd once held, Eno had saved Ginny. "A huge secret?" Eno asked, amused. "Yes," Hermione whispered, her expression grave. "It's Lockhart. He's been lying to everyone." "Harry found out. He saw it in Lockhart's office," Ron added, pounding the last words for emphasis. Fate, it seemed, had started to turn. Eno glanced up at the sky. "Come back to the castle. We can talk over dinner." In the Great Hall, Eno joined the trio at the Gryffindor table. There was nothing technically wrong with that. These tables weren't strictly owned by houses in the way everyone acted as if they were, but it still felt like an intrusion to some. Across the hall, Draco and Pansy noticed him. Pansy watched with a cool smile, but Draco rose and took a few steps forward before pausing, his expression sharpening. When he saw Hermione sitting next to Eno, he smirked meaningfully and returned to his seat. Hermione sat close and began to recount what had happened, leaning in so their conversation wouldn't carry across the crowded hall. From a distance, the posture looked intimate, two heads close together whispering, while Harry and Ron sat opposite like watchful guards, eyes sweeping the room and narrowing at anyone who came near. Hermione told the story in a rush. Lockhart had been cultivating a relationship with Harry, inviting him to his office under various pretexts, talks about ideals, recollections of adventures, to boost his own fame. Anything in itself showed nothing of consequence. But during one of those visits, something odd had occurred. A paper airplane had fluttered into the office. Lockhart left for a moment, telling Harry to wait. Then a book had fallen from a high shelf. When Harry picked it up, he found, under the sofa, a pink hairpin. Following that lead, Harry had found a notebook stashed away, cheap, filled with messy, fragmented notes. Still, amid the scraps he found proof. Lockhart had been using magic to appropriate other people's memories and experiences. The incidents in his books were stolen. All of Lockhart's published adventures, Hermione whispered, were fabrications. The great hall of the castle hummed with after-dinner chatter. It took Hermione about 10 minutes to recount the whole incident. We're helpless now, and I suspect Lockhart's already figured it out. He's been looking at me strangely, Harry said, a note of worry in his voice. Ino chuckled softly at Harry's anxiety. Mr. Potter, you're worrying for nothing. As long as you don't wander outside while Professor Dumbledore is here, no one can touch you. Dumbledore's name was like a spell. Harry visibly relaxed. That's true, Ron agreed. With Dumbledore around, no one dare be rash. Seeing the three of them nod in relief, Eno shifted his tone. Still, this can't be left hanging. You can't live in the castle forever. But we have no evidence, Hermione cut in immediately. That was the heart of the problem. A student accusing a professor, especially a celebrity like Lockhart, would be believed by no one without proof. In many cases, you don't need full proof, just a clue. That's enough for someone to help you find the rest, Eno told her, then lowered his voice as he turned to Harry. Go back now and write out everything you remember from the notebook, as exactly as you can. If you trust me, I'll help. Lockhart won't get away with this. Hearing Lockhart was involved, Eno already had a plan. Helping would curry favor with the headmaster and also put Harry in the spotlight again, an outcome Harry wouldn't obsess over once he knew Lockhart's true nature, but which could be useful. I trust you, Hermione said first. Ron chimed in shortly after. I trust you too, Ron said. I don't like you much, but you're not like other Slytherins. If it'd been someone else, they'd just sit back and laugh while Ginny gets hurt. After his friends spoke, Harry nodded decisively. I'll go back and write it now. You'll have it by tomorrow afternoon, at the latest. Slytherin dormitory. After dinner, Eno left the trio and headed back to the common room. The Lockhart problem was manageable. Someone would sort it out even if he didn't, but his instinct as a storyteller told him to stay involved. One could tell stories and sing them and share them, but you didn't bite the hand that fed you. Profiting from someone else's tale and then erasing their memory was worse than thievery. The dormitory door closed with a soft click. Draco returned from his patrol and swaggered in. Eno, you're in love, with a Gryffindor, no less. His tone mimicked Harry's earlier curiosity, as if he'd uncovered a scandal. I am not. Don't be ridiculous. Eno rubbed his temples. He had planned for many things, but not for bored castle kids gossiping. Draco grinned. Keep it secret all you like. Others won't. You should have seen the looks on the girls in our house earlier, like someone had snatched away their treasured candy along with the box. Enough. Eno cut him off. None of this mattered. They'd only been sitting and talking. By that logic, dancing at the Yule Ball suddenly meant marriage. Oh, right. Draco, could you do me a favor? Write a letter to Lucius for me. Draco's face turned serious. To my father? What's up? I'll write it now. It's nothing urgent, but it should be prepared, Eno said after a pause. He intended to bring Lucius in on the Lockhart problem. Snakes had their ways, and rats theirs. With Lucius's political nose, the stakes would be clearer. Whether or not to help Dumbledore, Lucius wouldn't ignore a chance to hedge bets, and this would be an easy opportunity. Two things, though. First, Harry's credit mustn't be taken away. He needs to be kept as the one who exposed this. And second, arrange some reward at least. Draco considered, then nodded. There's nothing to lose. And yes, only some fool would try to steal that credit. Lockhart's fans are stubborn. Taking the recognition wouldn't gain us anything. Good. Start on the letter, Eno said, leaning back. Draco's pragmatism showed up when Harry wasn't around. The quiet way to help was the best way. Stealing Harry's credit would offend Lockhart's supporters and gain no favor. I'll tell my father now, Draco said, moving to the table. Defense against the Dark Arts Office. Lockhart paced the room, agitation making his movements fussy. He was almost certain his secret was out. Harry's look during class had shifted, from helplessness to resentment and watchfulness. That change was obvious to anyone who'd been paying attention. Tired of pacing, Lockhart sank into his chair and absently raked his fingers through his perfect blonde hair. Why can't this be a win-win? Why didn't he come to me to negotiate? He couldn't understand it. If there was no direct conflict, what would Harry gain by exposing him? Yes, Harry might get fame, but he'd also make enemies. Negotiation would be sensible. Lockhart could offer concessions. After all, the reputation of Gilderoy Lockhart had value, but the way Harry had avoided him and the look in his eyes explained a lot. Gryffindor, you lot never think. If it comes down to it, 3 people need to be dealt with at once. Lockhart glanced at the wand on his desk and muttered under his breath. The office fell into a tense silence, broken only by the faint chirping of birds painted in the landscape frames on the walls. Chapter 123, Snape's Classroom. The Slytherin common room was unusually quiet at 8 in the morning. Only first and second years lingered. Few students had no early classes. In a corner on a worn sofa, Eno sat with 2 old books and a Gringotts coin pouch at his side. He had borrowed the books from Pansy, one on the freezing spell, the other on the snowmaking charm. The pouch held melted gold. Today he planned to repay Pansy for the room and return the books. When he had no money, there was nothing he could do. Now that he had half a sack of coins left to him by Jacob, it felt wrong not to settle his debt. He had skimmed the books and found them shallow, practical tricks, no deep theory about ice control. Controlling ice and snow, he thought, wasn't something you learned the way people learn to swim. For some, it was instinct. That, and he didn't want to repeat last time. Borrowing and then forgetting to return a book was mortifying, so he decided to return both items now. Up in the girls' dormitory, Pansy Malfoy changed into her robes as soon as a first-year knocked to deliver a message. Daphne lay on her bed and sighed. "Aren't you going to put on any makeup?" "No need," Pansy said, already smoothing her hair. "I'm not that Gryffindor mudblood who thinks a pretty face is everything. Eno values capable girls more than looks." Still, as she passed her dressing table, she idly picked up a bottle of perfume and sprayed it once or twice. "Eno," she called down the stairwell as she left. "Good morning. Sorry to bother you so early." Eno stood and half bowed as Pansy entered the common room. She smiled faintly. "It's fine. I don't sleep in late anyway, just idle in the dormitory." He set the coin pouch and the books on the small table. "Here, 3 pounds of gold to cover the room. Keep the rest as interest for the delay," he said. 3 pounds of gold, at Gringotts' exchange rate of 145 galleons per ounce, came to just under 7,000 galleons. He couldn't think of a more honest thing to do, given how rare it was for Hogsmeade properties to change hands through official channels. Pansy accepted the pouch without hesitation. "I'll take it. If you ever need anything, come to me." Eno bowed slightly. "Thank you." He watched her go and felt an odd respect for her efficiency and decisiveness. Pansy had none of the needless airs some girls wore. There was something of Professor McGonagall's firmness in her, softer, but practical and unpretentious. That made dealing with her easy. He checked the common room clock, 8:30. He had time for a quick breakfast in the Great Hall. By the time he returned, potions would be over, and he could hand back the Half-Blood Prince's notebook. The potions classroom was clearing out when he arrived. After the last students left, he knocked at the open door out of habit. Snape glanced up, his expression flat, then, seeing who stood there, adopted a cutting tone. "Humph, finally managed to grace potions with your presence? Did Transfiguration fall out of favor, Mr. Swinburne, our very own best newcomer?" Eno's stomach dropped. Professor McGonagall must have said something in the staff room. He swallowed and tried to keep his voice steady. "Professor, I'm here to return a book." Snape's mockery sharpened then softened ever so slightly. "Put it on the desk." He pointed to the lectern. "If that's everything, you may go." Eno set the notebook down, but hesitated. There was something he wanted, something worth more than the embarrassment. "Professor, I'd like to learn how to brew Felix Felicis. It would be very useful to me." Snape's lips twitched as if to lampoon him, but Eno met the look with earnestness, and the professor fell silent. "Start with processing ingredients," Snape said at last, in that cool, precise tone that made a command feel like a test. "Distillation, extraction, slicing, fermentation, purification, calcination, simmering. Master those techniques first. When you can do all of that properly, come to me and I'll teach you Felix Felicis." "Understood, Professor," Eno said, nodding seriously. He knew Snape wasn't pacifying him. This was real instruction. Snape added, almost offhand, "Every Tuesday from 7 to 9 in the evening. I have a number of ingredients that need processing. Come then." "I'll be there," Eno said, turned, and offered a small, respectful bow. A private lesson with a contemporary master of potions. How many would give anything for that? Such opportunities weren't bought with money. As he left the classroom, the notebook returned and a new appointment made. Eno felt a small, genuine thrill. He intended to make the most of it. 124. Hogsmeade, cameras and musical instruments, Hogwarts. In this ancient castle, standing for 1,000 years, time seemed to be gently stretched by magic and then quietly scattered by the breeze. 2 days for the students here were both long and short, like a peaceful dream. In the early morning, when the first ray of sunlight slipped through gaps between the spires and fell across the bluestone corridors, it heralded the start of a new day. It was another ordinary weekend. Draco woke and, out of habit, glanced toward the empty bed opposite him. Since the start of term, a delicate alarm clock had been set in the dormitory, so he no longer had to wake anyone, but a year of routine made him check anyway. When he saw the empty bed, he only smiled with understanding. He'd seen Eno and Flint huddled together suspiciously the night before. Hogsmeade, of course. At 9 o'clock that morning, after winding down a narrow alley, Eno returned to his little house. At the end of the lane, a 2-story house stood quietly, as if forgotten by time. Its outer walls were a little mottled, but to him those imperfections only made it dearer. This was his home. He pushed the door open. The first-floor sitting room, the sofa, and antique tea table were dusted with neglect. He hadn't properly cleaned since term began 2 months ago. "Scourgify," he said, and with a flick of his wand, the room was neat as new. He climbed the stairs to the combined bedroom and study on the second floor. Stained glass windows spilled warm light across the space. It felt like a small harbor, a peaceful refuge from the bustle of school. Eno took the blue bellflowers from the windowsill, ones he'd set there over summer and had long since withered, and opened the stained glass to let the sunlight in. He leaned back, and from the empty floor, a rocking chair of ice and snow rose silently to take him. He sat, the chill of the chair at odds with the autumn sun warming his face, and let his thoughts drift. His trip to Hogsmeade that morning traced back to yesterday. He'd received a letter from Mr. Dervish. The custom instruments were ready. Since the weekend had begun, he and Flint had bought a Hogsmeade pass, planning to collect them together. Eno had arrived early and, at 8 o'clock, taken everything from Flourish and Blots before returning to his little house. 10 items in all, among them a sharp one-handed sword and a large box camera, were now quietly stored in his sanctuary. The camera deserved special mention, a late 19th century wooden folding plate camera known as a Junior Sanderson, with a 6 4.5-inch plate, built of teak or mahogany. It was an antique and by Dervish's teasing admission, a free gift. It didn't need to be flawless, only usable, and so he had accepted it with a mixture of gratitude and reluctance. He thought, not without regret, that if he'd thought to buy a camera earlier, many people and moments could have been fixed for memory. Old John, the White Witch, Bjorn the Skin Changer, the Grimm brothers. The thought faded, and he closed his eyes, enjoying the sunlight and the quiet. He lost track of time. Outside the window, the village grew noisier. Older students who'd slept late were now streaming into Hogsmeade in groups. The sounds pulled him back. He glanced at the sky. The sun had slipped toward the southwest, 3 or 4 in the afternoon. "Ah, time to go back. Next year will be better," he murmured, standing and heading downstairs. He'd paid for the pass, and Flint had vouched it would hold until curfew, but he'd finished what he came for and saw no point in lingering. Before leaving, he forced down a mouthful of the nauseating polyjuice potion, then set off back toward Hogwarts. Back in the Slytherin dormitory, Eno filled his cup and drained a third of his honey lemonade in one swallow, then looked at Draco. "I'll tell Potter to keep himself in line for now," he said. "Has Uncle Lucius confirmed it yet?" Draco's lips curved into a small smile. "It's confirmed. There are still 2 more victims, farther away, so it'll take time." His expression held a faint impatience. The thought of Scarhead's face when the truth came out was almost enough to make him gloat. It would be a reminder that fraternizing with the redhead got you nothing. But then Draco's mood shifted. A letter from home had come with strict instructions. Say nothing, not a word. Pretend not to know. The command had the effect of deflating him like a pinpricked balloon. Eno watched Draco's fleeting expressions without comment, more impressed with Lucius Malfoy's efficiency. From the first letter to collecting decisive proof, it had taken only 3 days. Not every scrap of evidence had been gathered, but enough to show capability. Lucius had handled the matter with a kind of cold elegance: find the evidence, pass it to Potter through a go-between, and have no further involvement. Eno had been the third party. Lucius had engineered things so Eno would end up owing him a favor. That should have been simple gain for the elder Malfoy, except it also risked losing points with Harry. The contradiction nagged at Eno for a moment, then the reasoning cleared. This was the sort of move Lucius made on purpose, subtle and controlling. Eno sighed softly and glanced at his foolish roommate. "Draco, you really do have a good father," he said. "My father's always been good," Draco replied, puzzled but pleased by the praise. From childhood, his father had met his needs, reasonable and unreasonable alike, and Draco had learned to expect that kind of protection. Outside the dormitory, the day slid on, small noises of the castle life moving with it. Inside, plans and favors moved in quieter currents, where loyalties and debts were weighed in ways only Lucius Malfoy could fully appreciate. 125, Innate Grace, Transfiguration Club evening on the 3rd floor of the castle. A cold, deserted corridor, only 100 meters long, with no classrooms, no professors' offices, not even a decent room. After the first half-month of the term, when a few energetic new students wandered through, it turned into a veritable no-man's land. Sometimes not even Filch came this far. There were many similar corridors in the castle, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was that Eno had paced this stretch several times already. Tonight was the Transfiguration Club. In the short week that had passed, he had been through too much, more than one entire fantasy world, but he never neglected transfiguration. It was the closest thing to the essence of magic, and elemental transfiguration was central to his plans. Ice and fire, to reach their full effect, needed transfiguration's aid. A flame of salvation and hope that could not be controlled at will, that couldn't be fashioned into a shield or shaped mid-battle, was little more than a hearthlight. In the original story, he admired that prophet with different colored eyes, standing amid blue flames like a conductor, composing a grand movement with wand and fire. Perhaps because of his animagus training, Eno found himself drawn not only to playing with water, but to that innate elegance. Elegance wasn't affectation or awkward mimicry. It was confidence and bearing from the bone. It never went out of style. At the moment, though, he didn't feel very elegant. He checked the pocket watch in his hand. 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes until the club meeting. If he lacked natural talent, he thought, he would have to make do with clumsy methods. Winter is coming. There was no sudden drop in temperature, no fierce wind, only countless snowflakes, levitated and hanging in the air like crystal motes. Eno flicked his wand, and the flakes, as if taking a command, shifted into countless white butterflies that surged into the corridor. He had considered detection charms, but after Professor McGonagall's test, he had decided a simple detection spell would look childish. The transformation changed everything. The corridor became another world. White butterflies danced through the candlelight. Their fragile wings shimmered like frost in sunlight. They threaded among the pillars, brushed along walls, settled across every brick, suit of armor, and hanging portrait. The butterflies and candlelight braided together into a dreamlike tableau that took his breath away. Honestly, the sight was beautiful. It had been an accident, though. He'd meant to transfigure a billywig, but at the last second, the sight of a strange large hornet made him hesitate. In that moment of doubt, butterflies had slipped in and replaced the billywig. He was about to sense the corridor with his ice and snow attunement when a familiar voice cut behind him. "This is my Transfiguration Club." Professor McGonagall stood in the corridor, looking at the dancing swarm and pursing her lips. "Sorry, Professor." Eno turned and explained quickly. "I couldn't help it. I'm almost late, and I still couldn't find the entrance." McGonagall's eye twitched. She raised her wand and pointed at a nearby butterfly. Like a breath of warm air, the swarm reverted into delicate snowflakes and drifted away. "All right, this counts as transfiguration, but did you consider Gamp's law? Look at the painting. See how the apple in the fruit bowl has pineapple leaves? That's a hint. Transfiguration cannot create real food. Her tone was complicated, half relieved, half disappointed. Follow me. I'll take you in myself. Honestly, in over 20 years, you're the first. Wordlessly, he followed. Like nuns at the orphanage, he knew to keep quiet when she was annoyed, argue, and things only got worse. McGonagall led him to the painting of a dinner party, tapped her wand, and pointed at the fruit bowl in the corner of the table. Like a password, she tapped each strangely altered food, transfigured items, and then the painting slid aside. Behind it was a short corridor and a wooden door. McGonagall pushed open the door, and Eno saw who was inside. Handsome students, attractive faces, two people he recognized by their robes and house colors, Hufflepuff's warm yellow and Ravenclaw's blue. "Welcome." Cedric Diggory stood and greeted him first. "Cedric Diggory, Hufflepuff, 4th year." "Great, finally a new member," he added with a smile. "Cho Chang, Ravenclaw, 3rd year," Cho said, and she sounded genuinely pleased. She stepped forward and offered her hand. Eno hesitated for a beat, then responded with proper etiquette, taking her hand lightly in a polite, half-handed handshake, and smiled. "Eno Swinburne, Slytherin, 2nd year." McGonagall lingered for a moment, watching them. "I need to fetch some materials. I'll be back soon. You can talk among yourselves for a bit." He inwardly chuckled. Her intention was obvious. It was a good thing. If nothing unexpected happened, he, Cedric, and Cho would be here for the next few years. Building good relationships was important. Once the professor left, the small room relaxed. Cho broke the silence. "I heard you froze the classroom with a freezing spell," she said. And then, "Ha-ha!" Lockhart regained his confidence. That made things difficult for us 3rd years. She covered her mouth and giggled. "Not my fault." Eno spread his hands in mock innocence. He was the one who put bugs in the classroom first, a whole cage full. "Please collect. Please recommend. Please vote for monthly tickets. Please vote. Please vote. The double period is almost over. On May 7th at 12 p.m., the double period will end." Chapter 126. Really Unrestrained Imagination. The Transfiguration Club's small classroom felt unusually relaxed. Maybe it was because they were all about the same age, or maybe it was simply that no professor was hovering over them. "Oh, it's just the two of you? I thought there'd be more people tonight," Eno remarked softly as he settled onto a sofa that looked as if it had been carved from ice. There were no fixed seats in the room. Everything depended on a student's skill. Those with little magic sat on the floor or a simple stool. Those with more talent could conjure chairs, even beds, though no one would be foolish enough to lie on a bed in front of Professor McGonagall. "Last year, there were 5 of us, but 3 graduated this year," Cho said from a semicircular hanging basket chair, gently rocking it. She looked pleasantly languid. "Seems like it's getting stricter." "I thought Percy the prefect might show up," Eno said casually. "I hear he always gets top marks." "You mean Percy?" Cedric took over the conversation with a smile. "His grades are excellent across the board, but Professor McGonagall prizes flashes of talent in Transfiguration, true inspiration. Full marks are the bare minimum. Raw ability matters more." Footsteps sounded in the corridor. The wooden door opened with a click, and Professor McGonagall entered, a stack of 3 parchment scrolls in her arms. "Gentlemen, miss," she said briskly, "stop the chatter. We'll begin. The author of today's paper is someone you all know very well." She paused deliberately, drawing out the suspense. "The winner of the 1897 Today's Transfiguration Best Newcomer Award, the Hogwarts Student Council President, Albus Percival Dumbledore. His paper, Is Spellcasting Possible in Animagus Form?" The 3 students exchanged stunned looks. McGonagall allowed a faint smile to show, exactly the reaction she'd wanted. "Read the paper first," she continued. "But a word before we start. If any of you want to learn to become an animagus, tell me. I won't forbid it. Don't be like certain students a few years ago who did everything in secret and were nearly finished with the potion before I knew." Eno's gaze flicked subtly at the professor. He knew exactly whom she meant. He might well become one of those certain students in the coming years, perhaps even leave a little legacy at Hogwarts. He set that thought aside and unfurled the parchment in his hands. Silence fell as they read. Time slid by quietly. Half an hour later, McGonagall clapped once. "Tell me your thoughts. You don't need to justify everything with theory or strict logic. Be wild. Be absurd. Anything goes." The three sat for a moment, then McGonagall prodded, "Eno, you start. You're the only recent award-winning newcomer. Set an example." "All right," Eno said, standing up to speak without a hint of stage fright. "I think Professor Dumbledore's paper is feasible. Where does magic come from? If it were something learned late in life, muggles wouldn't exist. So I believe magic is rooted in blood, an innate talent." He glanced at Cho and Cedric, then continued. "There are many kinds of innate talent: seers, parseltongue, natural occlumens. My hypothesis is this. What if those talents can still be used in animagus form?" He slowed for emphasis. If a seer could see the future while in animal form, then Dumbledore's argument would stand. If innate magic can manifest through an animal form, why not integrate magic into that form, make it a natural ability? Think of thunderbirds generating lightning in flight, or a venomous leopard exhaling poisonous mist. Make magic a talent of the new form, and animagi would stop being merely human-turned animals. Ordinary animals would become extraordinary, new kinds of magical creatures. His ideas flowed faster and more freely as he spoke, like a dam breaking. 15 minutes passed before he finished. The room fell silent again. Cho and Cedric looked bewildered. Eno felt suddenly self-conscious that he'd run away with his imagination and turned to gauge McGonagall's reaction. She applauded without hesitation. "Exactly. Think boldly. Don't let what we already know constrain you. The advancement of spells, the discovery of new phenomena, rarely comes from rote learning or exam scores. It comes from imagination." "Thank you, Professor. Sometimes inspiration takes me somewhere I can't quite explain," Eno said modestly. "Relax," McGonagall replied with a smile. "This is my private club, after all." Her expression then sobered. "But remember one of Adalbert Waffling's basic rules of magic. First law, if you tamper with the deepest secrets, the source of life and the essence of the self, be prepared to face the most extreme and dangerous consequences." Eno nodded solemnly. "I understand, Professor." "Good." McGonagall looked at the other two. "Cho, Cedric, who's next? Time is limited. If we don't finish tonight, we'll have to carry this over to next week." Later that evening, just before curfew, the three walked down the third-floor corridor. "That was great. I'm looking forward to next week," Cho said, stretching and still looking relaxed. "Me too. I learned a lot," Cedric agreed. "Discussion and exchange are indispensable when you're learning." Eno smiled and sighed softly. At the end of the corridor, they went their separate ways, Cho toward the upward staircases, Cedric and Eno heading down. Eno glanced at Cedric, who had been unusually quiet the whole walk. He chuckled. "I need to go the other way. Good night." He had guessed Cedric's dilemma. Cho had been talkative and warm during the meeting, and Cedric had been shy and hesitant. Eno wasn't about to fuss. He'd listen if Cedric wanted to speak, but he wouldn't press. With a final nod, he went on his way, the castle settling into its evening hush. The corridor that led down to the Slytherin common room wound like a tunnel, torches guttering along the stone walls and throwing long, wavering shadows. He walked alone, his thoughts still circling the points they had just discussed. He was also turning over a way to test Dumbledore's thesis. It wasn't complicated. Find an object like the Mirror of Erised, transform into a black swan, and see if an item that reads the heart would freeze. If it did, it would show that the White Witch's ice and snow inheritance wasn't affected by an animagus form. All he would need, then, was to pursue the right experiments, and the black swan might become, in effect, a new magical creature. He reached the portrait hole that hid the entrance to the Slytherin common room. "Pure," he called. The wall slid aside, revealing a passage just wide enough for one person to squeeze through. It was 9:30, prime time in every house common room. Slytherin was no exception. Their arrogance was usually reserved for outsiders. In a corner of the cavernous room, Draco was perched in a chair, holding court to a gaggle of first to third years. Hogwarts, in practice, divided itself by age. Years 1 to 3 clustered together, 4 to 6 formed another circle, and the 7th years, pre-graduates, kept largely to themselves. Even within a house, there was little mingling. You couldn't expect 11 and 17-year-olds to share much. Seeing Draco, Eno walked over and sat down where he could listen. If he was going to be stuck at Hogwarts, he might as well enjoy the perks. School wasn't only for study. Draco's face lit up when he noticed him. He grew more animated, telling his audience one exaggerated adventure after another. After a while, he ran out of breath and with comic pomposity opened a can of butterbeer and guzzled it down. "Eno, you should tell them one," Draco said, setting the can on the table. "You haven't told a proper story since term started, and you promised last year you'd tell one about a snake." Eno didn't refuse. Spinning tales came easily to him. "All right," he said, "a story about a snake and love." For a beat, it felt as if someone had muted the common room. Conversation died down. A few younger students started slipping silently toward the dormitories to fetch friends. Eno barely noticed. His mind raced, improvising a plot that fit the old romantic notes Draco had expected. "About 600 years ago," he began, "in a remote farm in medieval France, there lived a young man named Leon. A half-blood wizard, he made his living as a coward. One day his dairy cow ran off into the deep forest. Deep in the wood, beside a pond, he found his cow," he continued, "and two lovely young women bathing. They belonged to the pure-blood Angus family that lived in a forested castle nearby." He used the opening of the Eastern myth Heavenly Match, here replaced by pure-blood maidens, and folded in a touch of the legend of the White Snake. A year went by. From meeting to acquaintance to love, Leon fell completely for a girl named Anne. But Anne had a sister, Anna, who watched them and burned with jealousy. Anna loved Leon too, and in her spite, she placed a terrible blood curse on her sister. "That curse turns the victim into an emotionless viper," Eno said, letting the words land with a measured fatalism. The plot was a patchwork. Two sisters in love with the same man, a poisonous spell born from jealousy, a rustic hero, and an enchanted woman, but the audience was rapt. Eno felt his thread wobble. The tale was winged improvisation without outline, but no one seemed to notice. He kept going. To spare the villagers, Leon took Anne, now a viper, and fled. They made a life in hiding on a small island. Their devotion moved the goddess of love, Venus herself, and every Valentine's Day she allowed Anne to reclaim her human form for a single day. When he fell silent, applause broke out around him. Several of the older Slytherin girls were visibly enchanted. A pure-blood noblewoman in love with a half-blood, faithful through misfortune. This was precisely the romantic misery they adored. Galleons clinked on the table. A hoarse voice from the crowd said, "Your story was wonderful. I want to pay you. I understand the custom." Eno looked up. The speaker was Mina Burke, a seventh-year prefect and a member of the Burke family, one of the ancient Sacred 28. Before he could answer, coins began to rain onto the table. Galleons and sickles piled until the surface was almost covered. Wait. Eno held up a hand, unnerved by the sudden generosity. "This was free. I promised this story last term and just never told it. Please, take your money back." When he refused, the Slytherins shuffled their coins away, some sheepish, some amused. His polite refusal won him a small measure of goodwill. A few older students exchanged respectful looks. The reason he declined wasn't lofty. The story had been a melodramatic vanity, a cobbled-together fable he was a little embarrassed to be paid for. Still, as he watched the coins disappear back into purses and pouches, he thought about Lockhart. Lockhart's success hadn't been entirely accidental. In a world with so little storytelling and entertainment, anyone with a little charm and the timing to strike could rise quickly. Right now, the wizarding world hungered for diversion. In that gap, a person with ability, an engaging voice, a flair for the dramatic could make a name for themselves. Meow, meow, meow. Thanks for the support. Big shots. Xiaodi finally finished coding before 7 o'clock. 128. Magic beans in the greenhouse. In the Slytherin common room, Eno plucked the harp on his lap, coaxing out a slow, familiar melody from memory. It was nearly December. The Christmas holiday would come soon, and after that, the second half of the Hogwarts Quidditch House Cup would begin. He didn't have much time. After half an hour of continuous composition, he set the harp aside and looked up to find Draco watching him with an expression full of hesitation and eager curiosity. "If you have something to say it. If not, go to sleep," Eno said, unusually forward. He would have waited for Draco to speak if Cedric had been there, but he wasn't, and Eno didn't mind taking the initiative. "Eno, your story isn't finished. What happened to Leon and Annie's child in the end? Rick can't have stayed on that island forever." Draco leaned forward, analyzing the plot like it was a case to be solved. Eno laughed. He hadn't realized Draco had been waiting for more. The little tale had been improvised on the spot. There was no continuation. Still, Draco's hopeful look tugged at him. After a beat, Eno decided to spin another fragment. Later, when Rick grew up, he slipped away from the island without telling his parents. He looked so much like his father, Leon, that by coincidence he met his young, beautiful, though a bit wicked Aunt Anna without realizing who she was. Well, they tangled up in another relationship. Draco blinked. That's it? What happens next? Eno spread his hands, feigning innocence. That's it. There's no more. Draco froze. He stared, then slowly recovered. He would have preferred a complete ending. Leaving a story hanging felt worse than hearing a mediocre one. There really isn't any more? I swear, Eno said, grinning. Then, as if thinking of a way to placate him, he added, Wait, I'll tell you the rest when I think of it. Go to sleep now. Then tell me the minute you think of it. Draco trailed off toward his bed, clearly unsatisfied, but halfway across the room he stopped and wheeled back. Why don't you write it down? I can put you in touch with Obscurus Books. My father and their editor-in-chief are friends. I guarantee this will sell better than Lockhart's books. The publisher's suggestion tugged at Eno's pride. Any bard worth the name would leap at the chance to publish. Books were the closest thing to immortality for storytellers. Good idea, he admitted. But let's wait until summer. I'll tidy up a handful of proper stories first. Draco's face fell. Why wait until summer? That last bit was amazing. Couldn't we publish a single volume now and add the rest later? Eno smiled privately. Publishing and telling a tale were different beasts. A boy under 14 putting his name on a scandalous, twisty love story would be risque to say the least. No single volume. I'll make something even better over the holidays. I'll give you a signed, limited edition. Draw an illustration for it, too. Draco beamed at the promise. It's a deal. He finally went to bed satisfied. Night passed quietly. Dawn came. The alarm roused Eno, and he rose, washed, and dressed with his usual careful routine. He pushed open the dormitory door and slipped out into the castle. Sunday mornings were always softer, less rushed, the corridors carrying a faint sense of leisure. The mist still clung to the forbidden forest in the distance. Eno glanced at its shadowy edge without any real interest. He had no desire to explore it today. Not in secret, at least. He headed instead to the greenhouses for herbology. Outside the herbology classrooms, he crouched beside a pile of rejected flower pots and began sorting. The magic beans William Grimm had given him, blessed, according to the old man, by the goddess of the harvest, felt like a little miracle in his pocket. Who wouldn't be excited to plant something with that kind of pedigree? But first, he needed a few decent pots. He inspected pot after pot. Hairline cracks, hidden flaws, chips along the rims. None of them would hold a promising sapling. He was about to transfigure an emergency pot when a gentle voice floated from the greenhouse doorway. You won't find any usable ones in that pile. They were brought out yesterday. Everything that was salvageable has already been screened. Eno looked up. Good morning, Professor Sprout. Pomona Sprout peered out, smiling. She remembered faces better than names these days, but she remembered him well. One of the few first years who actually seemed to love herbology, much like a certain chubby Gryffindor boy she had taken to notice. Come with me, she said. Greenhouse 7's leaping toadstools are getting restless. If you help me soothe them, I'll give you some proper pots as payment, if you're willing. Of course, I'd be honored. For a young gardener, a relationship with Professor Sprout was worth more than a few pots. He wanted to learn her methods, especially the way she could point her wand at soil and tell what it needed. That kind of plant-sensing magic would be invaluable when he finally planted the Grimm beans. Greenhouse 7 was a riot of movement the moment he pushed the glass door. Leaping toadstools, tight balls of hyacinth-like blossoms that loved to hop, bounced everywhere, on windowsills, on benches, even bristling across the floor. A few had tipped over, their soil spilling like confetti. Professor Sprout hesitated at the doorway, then smiled. You can call me Pomona, if you like. Eno, he said quickly, offering his name before she could fumble. He'd noticed she sometimes forgot names. Hufflepuff had an enormous cohort this year, but he didn't want to be one she missed. Right, Eno. Do you know how to soothe these ones? He had read up on them. You calm the mature leaping toadstools with warmth, light, and a little controlled fire, and the younger ones, you can press them gently into the soil with your hand until they settle. A perfect answer. She beamed approval. If this were class, you'd earn extra points. Pomona's face softened. She clearly appreciated students who put real effort into their studies. Herbology wasn't the most popular subject at Hogwarts, and those who showed interest were a breath of fresh air. Eno grinned, then rolled up his sleeves and stepped into the bouncing chaos, ready to settle toadstools and earn his pots. Chapter 129, Flame of Hope and Popping Bulbs. Greenhouse number 7 was alive with bouncing bulb stems. Under Professor Sprout's watchful eye, Eno drew his elder wand and whispered, "Incendio." A small ball of flame the size of a fist ignited at the tip of his wand, a compact, warm light that seemed to promise something more than heat. Before he could think further, the greenhouse changed. The cheerful chatter of the bouncing bulb stems fell silent. As if newly aware, the plants began to move with surprising coordination, sliding and bobbing toward the floating flame like tadpoles drawn to a mother or ants migrating in perfect order. In moments, every bouncing bulb stem had gathered at Eno's feet. A remarkable bit of magic. Professor Sprout, who had been silent until then, stepped forward. She watched the hovering flame closely, knelt and tapped the clustered stems gently with her wand. After a moment, she rose and sighed, smiling. "Eno, you must study herbology well," she said. "I think one day you might become another herbology master." That was high praise indeed. In the wizarding world, a master is a title that carries respect everywhere, not just in Britain. Eno felt both honored and a little overwhelmed. "Thank you, Professor," he said. "That means a lot." "No need to be overwhelmed," Sprout replied. "What you did with Incendio is unusual. The bouncing bulb stems have visibly changed. The change is subtle, but real." She became serious. "And I don't think this is an isolated case. That flame may be able to alter the properties of many plants, devil's snare, Mimbulus mimbletonia, umbrella flower, but we'll study that later. For now, let's replant these energetic fellows." She knelt and began gathering the bouncing stems, and Eno rolled up his sleeves to help. Half an hour later, the bouncing bulb stems were back in their pots, and Greenhouse 7 had returned to its usual quiet. "Eno, may I ask you something?" he said after a pause, testing the waters. "It's about that magic to sense plants. I meant to ask before." Professor Sprout smiled. "Go ahead. We don't keep knowledge locked away here. My duty is to teach. If you want to learn, come to me." Eno brightened. "I've wanted to learn it for a long time." "There's one thing first," she said. "The version I use is a modification of Scarpin's revelatory spell. Before I teach you my version, you should learn the original Scarpin spell. Come with me." She led him out of the greenhouse to the herbology classroom office, a short walk away. The office was simple: a large desk and chair, a tall bookshelf, and a wooden sofa. Potted plants filled every available surface, making the room feel like a cozy corner of a garden. Professor Sprout pulled a yellowed notebook from the shelf. "Here, this contains my modifications of Scarpin's revelatory spell. Take it and study it. If you have questions, come see me. The spell itself isn't dangerous." Eno took the notebook with both hands. "Thank you, Professor. I'll study diligently and keep it safe." Sprout nodded. "And Eno, if you don't mind, come to Greenhouse 7 more often. I want to observe these altered bouncing bulb stems." He thought for a moment, then agreed. "No problem. I'll come every Saturday afternoon." They had reached a simple understanding. He would learn and keep watch. She would guide and study. The greenhouse hummed softly outside, the changed stems asleep in their pots, and the promise of new lessons hung in the warm, plant-scented air. After leaving the herbology greenhouse, Eno headed for the library. A Sunday morning shouldn't be wasted. This was a good chance to look up Scarpin's Revela spell. As usual, Madame Pint sat at her desk, quietly reading. Unless there was an emergency, she would remain absorbed until noon. Respecting that, Eno didn't announce himself. He chose a few charms volumes, found a spot by the window, and began to read. He'd been thinking about charms all afternoon in the greenhouse, and it pushed him back to the subject again. Coming from an orphanage with a shaky foundation, he knew he would have to learn more slowly and carefully than others. A little slower, a little clumsier. At least it was steady progress. He was bent over a sixth-year standard book of spells when someone sat opposite. There were only a few people in the library that morning, and he'd thought he'd picked a quiet corner, but someone had chosen to share his table. He was too engrossed to look up. The only reassurance was that whoever it was had been perfectly silent for a long while. Across the table, Hermione had come to the library to do homework. The noise in the dormitory had made studying impossible. She paused at the sight that met her. Morning sunlight pouring through the ancient stained glass windows, dappling the quiet room. A black-haired boy by the frame, pale gold eyes intent on his book. The sunlight gilded his profile. He turned pages with a fingertip. The soft rustle blended with the hush of the library into a kind of private music. Without hesitation, she crossed and sat down opposite him, resting her chin on her hand, savoring the view. When Eno finally finished the chapter and lowered the book, he found himself staring into Hermione's slightly dazed face. Smiling, he waved his hand in front of her eyes. Bang! A soft thud. Startled, Hermione's arm went limp and her chin bumped the edge of the table. She rubbed the sore spot, glanced around to make sure Madame Pince hadn't noticed, and then tried to play it off. Eno bit back a laugh. He had a hard time reconciling this shy, clumsy side with the fierce girl of the original story, but they were in the library, so he forced the laugh down and flicked his wand from his sleeve. Muffliato! He cast the silencing charm, then teased. What's wrong, Miss Granger? You look a bit out of it today, like a tipsy pygmy puff. He expected a verbal retort, but Hermione simply dropped her eyes and flushed. Since the latter half of last year, she had stopped being as prickly as when she first arrived at school. Now, she looked more embarrassed than offended. Eno saw that she was at a loss for words, so he pulled out a small notebook, scribbled a line, and pushed it across the table with his quill. Hermione paused, then picked up the quill and wrote back. Even with the silencing charm between them, they fell back on the simplest form of conversation, writing. The little notebook became an invisible bridge, shuttling messages in silence. Time seemed to blur under the warm morning sun as the notebook moved back and forth. Gradually, Hermione relaxed. A faint smile appeared without her noticing. When she finished and handed the notebook back, she looked up expectantly. Eno read her neat handwriting, met her eyes, and nodded, resigned but pleased. By the time the sun crept high, it was noon. Eno closed his book and rubbed his stomach. Time to check out the volumes he hadn't finished. Hermione had slipped away half an hour earlier. He walked over to Madame Pince's desk. She looked up with a small, amused gleam. I saw it all. You and that Gryffindor girl writing instant messages. But what you were doing. Why? I did the very same thing 20 years ago. Her tone was almost triumphant, the way children gloat over a shared discovery. Then, more wistful, she added, the librarian back then was even stricter than I am. She used to discourage the very sound of quills on paper. Still, sometimes I miss her. Eno set his book down and offered, Time's main purpose is to let us enjoy the scenery along the way, not to get stuck in the past. Though, to be fair, you are strict enough. Remember that Ravenclaw who sneezed the other day? Madame Pince cut him off indignantly. Was that a sneeze? Merlin. It sounded like thunder. If I hadn't shown him the door, I wouldn't have earned my salary. That's all for today. Xiao Dai plans to share some official Harry Potter knowledge every day from now on, starting with Fantastic Beasts. Pygmy Puff. Appearance. Looks like an underdeveloped piglet. Short legs, long tail, squinty black eyes. Characteristics. Afraid of pure white dogs, even if the dog is a transfiguration. 131. The growing study group time, like the Gryffindor hourglass in the Great Hall, trickled away grain by grain, assisted, as usual, by Professor Snape's particular brand of attentiveness. December arrived, and the castle hummed with a different kind of energy. Christmas was looming, and everyone looked forward to it. For 7th years, the summer holidays meant farewells and melancholy, but Christmas was, for once, something everyone could enjoy. In the Slytherin dormitory, after a long scouring charm cleaned the room, Eno sat to one side and stared at 3 small new clay pots on the table. Inside each was a single magic bean, given to him by William Grimm. William had handed over half a box, 163 beans, and, under the probing of Scarpin's Reveille spell, only 3 showed any sign of life. It made him thoughtful. The tavern keeper had claimed to have bartered 3 legendary stories for 3 magic beans. 3 more had been burned in the tower, and now 3 were growing here. Everything in that world seemed to come with a cost. Maybe, Eno considered, if you understood the price and played by the rules, every corner of that world could be a treasure waiting to be found. He moved the pots carefully to the shelf beside his bed to keep them from being knocked over. The dorm would be full soon. This morning they had another uncompromising history of magic cram session, and Draco had already gone to fetch people for the lecture. By the time everyone had gathered, it turned out to be a surprise. 23 second years filled the dormitory. There was no choice but to make it formal. Eno had conjured a temporary blackboard on the wall with a transfiguration charm. He stood at the back and addressed them. Ahem. Good afternoon. Although most of you know each other, some are here for the first time, so I must be clear about what this is. He turned and wrote 2 words on the blackboard: correct learning, independent thinking. He looked back over the faces. Draco, Pansy, Daphne, Goyle. Why study history of magic? Does it mean anything? I think all of us have wondered that. Listening to an ancient ghost drone on can feel like a waste of time sometimes. You might even be tempted to stupefy yourself. The joke eased the room. When the laughter died, he refocused them. History, to me, is like an axe. It can split open the frozen sea inside us. We all want knowledge, strength, peace. But first, we need the ability to think for ourselves. Pansy raised her hand. Miss Parkinson, please speak, he said with deliberate formality. Do we really lack the ability to think independently from start to finish? That's an excellent question. Eno clapped softly and regarded her with approval. Independent thinking means not believing anything and anyone without scrutiny. We must question people, our institutions, the ministry, even the spirit of our age. History of magic trains that. Now, everyone, open your modern history books to page 167. Professor Binns was lecturing on a wizarding movement from half a century ago. Concentrated study makes time slip away. The hour flew by as they reviewed the major events from 1926 to 1945 and the shifts in wizarding minds. All right, that concludes today's review on Professor Binns. Don't forget the essay assignment. He dismissed the transfiguration on the blackboard as the students filed out. Only Pansy and Daphne remained, and Draco lingered at the doorway before turning back. Eno dropped the formal tone. He propped himself up on his bed against a thick pillow, half reclining under the duvet. You 3, well, not including Draco, what earth-shattering revelations are you bringing? Make it quick. I've still got some energy. Daphne grinned. Look at you, already tired of us after half a semester. How tragic. She laughed and dramatically clutched her chest. Daphne hopped onto his bed without hesitation. Eno, you said independent thinking, Pansy said, unusually serious. But after thinking about it, I can't see a future for wizards. From modern history, since the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy in 1692, our places have been shrinking. A sharpness lit her eyes. Why do we always retreat? I don't understand. Since the statute was signed, wizarding communities in Greater Manchester, Yorkshire, Derbyshire, Hertfordshire disappeared. The whole British Isles were reduced to Diagon Alley and Hogsmeade. We've been in retreat for centuries. She went silent for a breath, then added, but thinking about that movement from 50 years ago, you were discussing it, I think I've found an answer. Eno felt his patience fray and wanted briefly to bolt from the room. Encouraging independent thought among the little snakes had its consequences. It calmed some and sent others off on wild tangents. Daphne sniffed and teased. Stop being dramatic, she said to Pansy, but Pansy's agitation lingered. Draco, who had stepped back into the doorway, watched the exchange with a neutral expression. Eno rubbed his temples. Pansy, explain it. If you've figured something out, spit it out, but keep it sensible, please. Pansy took a breath and began to outline what she'd been thinking, her voice determined, sharp with the excitement of a theory she'd wrestled into shape. The 3 beans on the shelf, the half-box from William Grimm, the shrinking of wizarding enclaves, the old movement. Her thoughts clicked into place, and the little study group settled into the kind of discussion that could, Eno suspected, lead somewhere dangerous and brilliant in equal measure. 132. Explain thinking and possible solutions. The atmosphere in the dormitory was heavy. Eno half regretted starting the study group. It was meant to be a simple review session, but it always slid into what felt like a secret meeting, and someone inevitably voiced startling ideas. He was also relieved they were meeting in the dormitory, where there were no portraits on the walls. If they'd met elsewhere, even in the room of requirement, Dumbledore might have turned up the next day, offering his warmth. But that thought could wait. Pansy had already gone somewhat off course, and it was on him to steer things back. Seeing Pansy worked up, Eno decided to be blunt. Honestly, your idea makes a lot of sense, but you're missing a crucial factor. He held out a hand to get Pansy to sit so she'd stop pacing and hyperventilating. Do you remember the Goblin Rebellions? He asked. Why did the goblins finally back down? It's simple. Their overall strength was weaker than the wizards. They might have gained the upper hand at first, but clever as they are, they could see they couldn't ultimately win. Goblins are intelligent. Don't wizards have intelligence? Pansy protested. In that case, why did we retreat? Why compromise? Because we couldn't fight the entire Muggle world. During the witch hunts of the Middle Ages, if a Muggle family's child had a magical outburst, that child could be turned over to the gallows by their own parents. Eno used the witch hunts to ground Pansy's emotions in facts. Why did the four founders establish Hogwarts? Before the Book of Admittance and the Quill of Acceptance, children born to Muggle families who showed magic had only one fate. Their families might sell them off for a few coins stained with blood. If that continued, without new families joining the magical population, relying on the existing pureblood families to repopulate Britain would be useless. As he laid out the reasoning, Pansy slowly calmed. Eno, thank you, she said softly. I think I understand now. It's pointless to act when the strengths are so unequal. She sighed, seeming to accept the reality, and Eno relaxed. But then she added something that made him wince. I'm taking Muggle Studies next year. Will you help me study for it? Looking at the determined glint in her eyes, Eno felt resigned. Given how everything had gone, he couldn't exactly refuse. All right, he said. We'll study together next year, but just the two of us. Don't drag half the dorm into it. Then it's settled. Pansy's lips twitched into a smile that carried a warm brightness. The dormitory door slammed. Bang! And the room fell quiet. Eno stretched out on his bed, savoring the rare moment of peace. They lay there for a long while. Draco, who had been silent up to that point, finally muttered, Pansy's being a bit foolish. Eno frowned instinctively. If he had to do it all over again, he thought, he'd opt for Hufflepuff, eat, sleep, tend gardens, and never worry about these debates. How pleasant that would be. Draco's voice continued calmly, as if he were commenting on the weather. I don't have any bright ideas, but I know everything needs matching strength. Back when I had run-ins with Scarhead and the Weasley, I could only curse at them. After I put them through their paces in the dueling arena last time, they're careful around me now. Hearing this, Eno breathed a little easier. He was somewhat glad that little snakes were wary of Draco. No ideas are best, Draco said. Study hard, do well on your exams, and don't disappoint Lucius. I'll study hard, Draco affirmed, then brightened. Eno, can you teach me a few more spells? Today's writing is done. Xiaodi plans to share some official Harry Potter knowledge every day from now on, starting with Fantastic Beasts. Pygmy Puff, appearance. Looks like an underdeveloped piglet, short legs, a long tail, squinty black eyes. Characteristics. Terrified of pure white dogs, even when the dog has been created by transfiguration. 1 in 33. Family magic and tower arrangement. When Draco asked to learn magic so bluntly, Eno's first reaction was a headache. He'd come to understand that the little Slytherin had a knack for making mischief. The way Draco asked, so calm, so certain, reminded him oddly of two very different figures, a worried, crusading Grindelwald and a quieter Tom Riddle. Still, Eno believed in the Malfoy line. They weren't the sort to lead revolutions. With that in mind, he answered the request. Draco, go buy a copy of Practical Household Magic. It'll do you good. Household magic? Draco's face registered disbelief. Eno, lying on the bed, picked up his wand from beside his pillow and smirked. Pulp separation. A thin white beam shot from the wand tip and hit the ceramic teacup on the table dead center. There was no dramatic explosion, The cup simply cleaved into neat square porcelain tiles, and the lemon honey liquid slid cleanly to the other side of the table as if separated by an invisible partition. See, household magic, perfect for peeling pomegranates. Draco stood frozen, staring. Eno laughed softly, drew the bed curtains closed, and said from behind them, "I'll nap for a bit. Remember to use a healing charm on that teacup. I've used it for over a year." Left alone, Draco quietly drew his wand. He didn't fix the cup right away. Instead, he prodded the evenly cut porcelain squares with the tip of his wand, as if inspecting them. Life flowed on in its quiet way. Later that evening, at the top of the astronomy tower, the usually lonely spot felt oddly alive. Without astronomy class in session, the tower's isolation was familiar, but tonight a low, chaotic chorus filled the space. Dozens of instruments seeming to play themselves, each making its own odd contribution until the disparate noises merged into a steady, rousing melody. It sounded like old friends reuniting, easy, warm, wordless. After about 15 minutes, the music faded. Eno sat on the cold stone chair and exhaled. Controlling one instrument was one thing. Arranging a whole orchestra of self-playing alchemical devices was something else entirely. Even though Dervish had crafted each instrument to play itself, the timing, when to start, how fast to move, when to stop, had to be planned precisely. The timpani had been the worst, as the heartbeat of the piece, its rhythm, tempo, and pitch affected everything else. Fortunately, the hard part was done. The instruments had recorded the entire piece like a tape recorder, so what remained was simply pressing play at the right moment. He packed away the devices slowly, then walked to the platform at the tower's edge. From there, under the twilight, the castle layout spread, memory and stone and shadow. A week had passed since their last History of Magic review class, and a lot had happened. The review group had disbanded, partly because it drew too much attention, and partly because of a warning from Snape. Eno still remembered Snape's calm words before he left. "Don't try anything in Slytherin. We're all still alive, and I'd like it to stay that way." The remark had sounded like both a warning and a sign that someone was already watching. That was enough to seal the group's fate. Snape didn't speak lightly, and when he did, you listened. Eno chuckled and glanced toward the Forbidden Forest, pink at the edges from the setting sun, then climbed down from the tower without looking back. In the Gryffindor common room, the warm colors and chatter made everything feel lively. Hermione set a parcel on the table with careful hands. It was about a foot across and 2 inches thick, wrapped tightly in brown paper, so neatly sealed it might as well have been locked. "Harry, these are all the pieces of evidence about Lockhart. Eno asked me to give them to you," she said softly, but with a quiet pride on her face. Harry blinked. He hadn't expected Eno to hand over the evidence rather than simply report it. Hermione shrugged. "If you found it, you should handle it." Eno was fair. He didn't want the credit. There was a hint of disappointment in her tone, as if she wished Harry would do the obvious thing. Ron, sitting beside them, reached out and patted Harry on the shoulder with theatrical solemnity. "Listen, mate, Eno did the honorable thing. This could be our chance to get famous." Ron's voice tried to sound grown up, but his eyes shone. As the least noticed Weasley, he hungered for attention. Exposing Lockhart would be the perfect ticket. He was already plotting how to attach his own name to the scandal, even if it was only a passing mention in the Prophet. Harry set the parcel down, turning it over in his hands. Who should we go to? Dumbledore? But Lockhart came with him. Ron's excitement only rose at that. "I can write to my dad. He's got connections at the ministry, and he's never liked Lockhart. Mum, on the other hand, adores him. She'd be devastated." Hermione, practical as ever, added, "Make a magical copy and give one to Professor McGonagall. There's no one more impartial at Hogwarts." Harry nodded, about to open the parcel, when Ron yanked his hand back. "Are you crazy? Don't open it here." He glanced around. Though they sat in a corner, there were always ears. "Let's go to Hagrid's hut, and Harry, take your invisibility cloak." Harry understood the hint, went up to the dormitory, and retrieved the cloak. Xiaodi's magical creatures sharing today. Color-changing giant snail. Level, XXX appearance. Looks like a giant snail that changes color every hour like a living kaleidoscope. Habits. Leaves a highly toxic trail wherever it crawls. Plants that come into contact with its venomous slime wither and burn. 134. registering animagus. The spiral staircase of the astronomy tower was cleverly designed. Only about 2 feet wide, it wound upward so that anyone climbing it felt as if they were peering down from above. As he left the tower, Eno suddenly stopped in the corridor. Not far off, several Ravenclaw girls were laughing as they passed. Moonlight pooled like water on the stone, and the candlelight fell softly across the face of an East Asian girl, whose features were subtly different from the more angular faces common at Hogwarts. The girl's expression was gentle and delicate. Each small smile made her seem more graceful. He spotted Cho Chang nearby, but there were several girls with her, so he offered a small, discreet greeting, a smile and a nod. Cho didn't respond subtly. She left her companions and walked straight over. "I thought you only ever noticed me on Thursday evenings," she said with a hint of reproach. "I didn't expect you to greet me in the corridor, too." "Sorry," Eno replied apologetically. "I usually sleep in my dormitory, so I don't get out much." The truth was, he and Cho got on well enough, but their pleasant interactions were mostly limited to the Transfiguration Club on Thursday evenings. "Sleeping?" Cho's chin lifted slightly, disbelief showing in her dark brown eyes. She leaned in and lowered her voice. "Do you know some people run from the first floor to the 8th just to bump into me, then walk down as if nothing happened? But you, when I try to bump into you, I can't ever find you." Eno took a half step back without thinking. Despite their rapport at the club, he didn't want to risk offending a senior. School relationships were fragile. One wrong move and the bubble burst. Maybe some things would only make sense after graduation. "I really was sleeping," he said. "Other nights I go to the library." A flash of disappointment crossed Cho's face. She liked this junior. His looks and learning were on par with Cedric's, and his witty, mature comments in the Transfiguration Club stood out. But his instinctive step back and his offhand explanation told her something too. "All right then, see you Thursday." She shrugged and didn't press further. As a Ravenclaw, she understood some things couldn't be hurried. With at least 4 years ahead, there was time. Eno watched her go, smiled, shook his head, and headed down the stairs. Small interludes like that made life interesting. But after an interlude came the main course. He had to find Professor McGonagall and register his animagus form. He'd already decided to do it before climbing the astronomy tower. Keeping it secret wasn't fun. He couldn't freely enjoy the water, and if he wanted to test magic in his black swan form later, he'd have to be overly cautious. The only real advantage to hiding it seemed to be making an escape from Azkaban easier. Then again, who planned to spend their life plotting prison breaks? If it ever came to that, he'd hide in the sanctuary and stay there until he'd become a legendary wizard. He waited on the landing for the moving staircases to do their work. The thought of the sanctuary made him wonder about supplies and, more importantly, whether living creatures could be brought inside. Neither the planted ice flower nor Professor McGonagall's transfigured owl were truly living beings in the fullest sense. If a living creature could be brought in, could wizards? If wizards could enter, what about entire fantasy worlds? His mind drifted to Middle-earth, hundreds of wizards on broomsticks guarding Helm's Deep, the great battle of Minas Tirith against orcs, trolls, and ogres, thestrals tearing at ringwraiths. Wild scenes flashed by until he reached Professor McGonagall's office. Just as he lifted his hand to knock, the door opened from within, and 3 students filed out. The corridor fell quiet. "Eno," Hermione was the first to react, greeting him with surprise. "What a coincidence," he said, smiling and nodding at Harry and Ron as well. "We came because," Hermione started, then stopped and silently mouthed, "Lockhart. It's wisest for you to find Professor McGonagall," Ron muttered in relief. Professor McGonagall appeared at the doorway just then. "Go back once you've spoken with me," she said sternly to the 3. "Behave while you're at it. I will deal with the rest." She'd promised to keep her students out of trouble, but she wasn't blind to the mischief of recent years. The trio's sudden seriousness made her uneasy. Gryffindors had plenty of courage, she reminded herself, but often lacked tact. "We're going now," Ron and Harry said quickly, not forgetting to tug Hermione's sleeve as they hurried off. When the trio had left, McGonagall turned back to Eno with a weary look. "Speak. What is it now? The castle hasn't been this strange since last year." Despite the complaint, Her tone held no impatience. She appreciated Eno. The way he combined transfiguration with a smattering of Muggle philosophy always brought fresh perspectives to the club. In the transfiguration office, he wasted no time. "Professor, I plan to register my animagus form." "It's about time," Professor McGonagall sighed. She had promised discretion, but as a teacher, she genuinely didn't want one of her students to be embarrassed or punished by the Ministry if discovered. "You don't need to worry. Wait for my news. Coincidentally, I'll be making a trip to the Ministry within the next day or two." Shouty's magical creature spotlight for today. Chameleon giant snail. Level XX appearance. Looks like a giant snail, but it changes color every hour like a kaleidoscope. Habits. Wherever it crawls, it leaves a highly toxic trail. Plants that touch the venomous slime wither and burn. 135. The end of Lockhart. By mid-December, the temperature in the Scottish Highlands had already dropped below freezing. Hogwarts had its first properly heavy snowfall of the year. The whole castle looked as if it had been wrapped in a sheet of silvery gauze. The sky hung a deep gray blue, not unlike a winter in Narnia. Snowflakes drifted down like confetti, and outside the castle, the ground was a smooth white carpet. The lawns were dotted with snowmen, some of them so large and lifelike they seemed ready to greet passers-by. Of course, anyone who wanted to admire them had to be on their guard. Someone had played a trick, and a few mischievous snowmen were enchanted to throw snowballs at unprepared students. Those enchanted balls landed silently on the heads of unsuspecting young witches and wizards. It would have been hilarious if anyone had been out to see it. Today, the grounds were empty. Every student who could had packed into the castle, whispering about the major event that had happened 2 hours earlier. Gawain Robards, head of the Auror office, had personally led the team that marched into the Great Hall and arrested Professor Lockhart, the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, while he was eating lunch. Reporters from the Daily Prophet had accompanied them. It felt like ages since Aurors had stormed Hogwarts to take away a serving professor. Slytherin Common Room. Even though the arrest had happened hours ago, the Common Room was still buzzing, sharply, loudly, as gossip ricocheted off the stone walls. Draco came in from outside, holding a special reprint of the Daily Prophet. He ignored the commotion and went straight to his dormitory. Bang! The door shut behind him, and the Common Room clamor was instantly cut off. "Eno! Look at the latest." Draco waved the paper. Scarhead's famous again, and his Weasley sidekick too. "I don't know what they dug up, but the Ministry moved fast. Lockhart's already been convicted." "Convicted in hours?" Eno snatched the paper. The bold, blown-up headlines caught his eye. "Shocking scam. The trial of Lockhart. Harry Potter's role in the affair. A celebrity professor and a celebrity student. A tangled story." The Prophet had clearly written for hungry readers. Those headlines alone made you want to read on. Where other papers might have stopped, the Prophet filled a whole page, detailing Lockhart's crimes, sprinkling in salacious rumors, and even quoting random students they'd interviewed around the castle. Reading through, Eno finally reached the hard facts. Lockhart was suspected of fraud and intentionally causing harm. He'd been sentenced to 3 years in Azkaban, and all his property had been seized by the Ministry of Magic to be used in compensating those he'd harmed. Money talks. The Ministry's swiftness had less to do with publicity and more with pragmatism. Besides whatever pressure Professor McGonagall had applied, the prospect of confiscating the famous author's substantial assets had certainly sharpened their teeth. Once the evidence was conclusive, they'd move decisively. How much the victims would receive, everything would be hammered out by the Ministry. No more fresh pickled toad love letters on Valentine's Day. Eno sighed and casually tossed the paper onto the table. Valentine's Day. Draco's ears perked up, suddenly conspiratorial. "Are you in love? Tell me." "Don't be nosy. Aren't you more worried about what Scarhead's fans will do? Lockhart's followers won't just disappear." Eno knew that the only way to shut up a curious fellow student was to dangle something even juicier. Otherwise, the questions would never stop. Shouty's magical creatures share for today. Color-changing giant snail. Level XXX appearance. Like a giant snail, but it shifts color every hour like a living kaleidoscope. Habits. They leave a strongly toxic trail wherever they crawl. Any plant that touches the mucus withers and burns. Chapter 136. Once Promised, Granger Christmas Dinner, Part 1. Just as the entire wizarding world of the British Isles was in an uproar over the Lockhart incident, the Christmas holidays arrived on schedule. The 2-week break acted like a powerful fever reducer for Hogwarts. Everything cooled off temporarily, and the students scattered home to talk about the scandal with their families. As usual, Eno signed himself out on the departure list. Lily Street, Stone District, London. It was a prosperous residential neighborhood, classic upper-middle-class England. On Christmas Eve, as dusk fell, warm lights flickered behind curtained windows. Busy figures moved about inside, and laughter drifted down the street. 444 Lily Street, Eno murmured, checking the house numbers as he stood on the corner with his suitcase. His good clothes had kept him from attracting questions from patrolling officers and made it easy to enter the neighborhood. If it had been 2 years earlier, he would have had to wait until midnight, sneaking in under the cover of darkness and rummaging through the tossed-out belongings of wealthier households. Now, he stood at a polished front door, the address matching the note Hermione had given him. 3 weeks earlier, Hermione had written a Christmas invitation in her notebook. On a sudden impulse, he had agreed, something that still surprised him, but having made the promise, he intended to keep it. After buying a small box of Honeyduke's butterscotch, he had taken the night bus to the address. The house was a typical Victorian red brick with ivy climbing the walls. Snowflake stickers decorated the downstairs windows and the front door. Eno checked the number one more time, then knocked. Knock, knock, knock. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged woman with long brown hair pulled back by an unremarkable black clip. Her hair looked a little untended, but her manner was friendly and practical. "Hello, who are you looking for?" Eno said quickly. "Is this the Granger residence? I'm Hermione's classmate. She invited me to their Christmas dinner tonight." "Are you Mr. Swinburne? Come in, come in! Hermione told us about you ages ago." The woman threw the door wide and introduced herself as she guided him inside. "Oh, by the way, I'm Hermione's mum, Mia Prewett. If you don't mind, call me Aunt Mia." Eno smiled. "All right, Aunt Mia. You can call me Eno." He took off his coat and slipped into house slippers in the entryway, then followed her into the living room. The place felt oddly surreal to him. A glass chandelier hung above a modern living area. A television of at least 23 inches stood on a cabinet beside a bulky VCR and neatly shelved videotapes. He sat on a leather sofa and took it all in. Before he could organize his thoughts, a surprised voice called from the staircase. "Eno!" Hermione barreled down the stairs, hardly pausing for breath. Her words came out in a rapid burst. "I've been waiting for you all afternoon. I was so worried you'd forget. I almost thought you weren't coming. I was terrified you wouldn't find the address. It's getting late. Oh, thank goodness." "Merry Christmas, Hermione," Eno interrupted with a smile. He pulled the small package from his suitcase. "I brought you a present." "What is it?" Hermione asked, already peeling back wrapping paper. Opening a gift in front of someone feels like a courtesy, and she worked at it with eager hands. Mrs. Granger, who had been standing quietly nearby, let out a small, delighted exclamation as Hermione revealed the present. A delicate crystal ball with a tiny, perfectly detailed Hogwarts castle trapped inside. A subtle enchantment caused the weather inside the globe to mirror the real world's conditions. As night fell outside, the miniature Hogwarts turned to dusk within its sphere. "Mum!" Hermione cried, hugging the globe protectively as if afraid it might be taken. "It's mine!" Aunt Mia laughed. "I was only looking. I wasn't going to snatch it." She teased her daughter, amused by Hermione's sudden possessiveness. Eno watched the small domestic scene with a quiet warmth. The two of them clearly shared a close bond. 2 hours later, the dining room was full of home-cooked dishes and the table looked splendid. One person, however, was conspicuously absent, Mr. Granger, the dentist. Eno decided it would be impolite to pry into someone else's family business, so he simply took his seat next to Hermione. "I'm sorry, it's only the 3 of us tonight," Aunt Mia said as she came in from the living room. Though she kept a normal expression, Eno could see the disappointment in her eyes. "Dad's working late again? Was that him on the phone just now?" Hermione guessed when she realized only 3 would sit down. "Indeed," Aunt Mia replied. "Uncle George has acute pulpitis. He phoned to say he can't make it home tonight. Why on earth couldn't he have picked another night to fall ill? She stopped mid-sentence, catching herself. Realizing she should not complain in front of her daughter's classmate, she changed the subject with a decisive little smile. Eno, Hermione told me you live in a wizarding community. What's it like there? Eno brightened. Of course, Aunt Mia. Hogsmeade is the only remaining wizarding village in Britain. The Hogwarts Express stops nearby, and as he described the village, Aunt Mia's expression softened with curiosity and a touch of longing. I'll be staying there the whole Christmas holiday, Hermione said, turning to her mother. If you're free, I'd love to have you and Dad come visit. Mr. Granger, too. Eno added, as a courtesy, if you'd like, you could visit Hogsmeade sometime. Aunt Mia looked interested, but after a beat she shook her head with regret. Oh, no, it's not that simple. The clinic's appointments are fully booked until after New Year. Eno didn't take the refusal personally. In the adult world, commitments were rarely so simple to rearrange. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly. The three chatted through a large, festive meal, and time slipped by faster than Eno would have thought. About an hour before midnight, he stood to leave. Mrs. Granger insisted he stay, but he declined politely. Draco, Pansy, Daphne, Neville, and others were due to arrive the next day, Christmas Day itself, and he had promised to be elsewhere. After saying farewell to Hermione, he picked up his suitcase and stepped back out into the night. Under the deep blue sky, a black swan cut across England. Eno's animagus form soared above the houses, one of the few recorded in recent decades. He had registered as an animagus with the Ministry, albeit quietly, and at Professor McGonagall's request, the Ministry had not made it public. Because of that registration and the nature of the transformation, Eno felt no pressure using the form. More practically, an animagus change would not trigger the trace. When the trace had been designed, who could have imagined that an underage wizard, one still years from graduation, would master such a pinnacle of transfiguration? Hogsmeade sparkled from above. At this height, the whole village looked edged in light, every shop strung with colored bulbs for Christmas, and magical candles floating like lanterns along the streets. Eno located the coordinates of his little house, swooped down, and slipped through an open second-floor window. He dispelled his travel magic, waved his wand to light the candlestick on the table, and half collapsed onto the bed. After living with Hermione's more modern comforts, coming back to Hogsmeade felt like stepping into the Middle Ages. Magic was wonderful, but the gap between wizards and muggles, their lifestyles, their ways of thinking, felt absolute, like two separate worlds that barely touched. Dawn came quietly, a thin line of light tearing at the darkness. The village woke under the eastern sun. At the Three Broomsticks, Eno sat in a corner and ordered a kidney pie, planning to eat while waiting for his friends to arrive through the flu network. 10 minutes later, Madame Rosmerta set a steaming plate down in front of him, but instead of retreating to the bar, she sat opposite and teased him. I always figured that sort of thing was a favorite of middle-aged men. Didn't expect you to like something so flavorful. Eno paid no mind to the ribbing and took a bite. The pie was a classic. Lamb kidneys and fresh vegetables seasoned and baked in a buttery crust. He put down his fork with a satisfied smile. You can't judge a dish by its usual audience, he said. Besides, your cooking is brilliant. Rosmerta sniffed and grinned. Save the compliments for the girls, or don't. I know them well enough. Her pride showed for a moment. Even if the pub wasn't as crowded as it used to be, her food kept people coming. She glanced then toward the fireplace. Why don't you try the flu network? I thought all the houses in Hogsmeade had it connected. You can open a home's flue in different ways. You can make it so you can leave by fire, but others can't come in without your permission. She explained it in plain terms, clearly watching him with concern. Eno felt warmed by it and laughed a little. It's not that I don't want to, I just don't know how. I've never had a house with a flue before. You should have said so. Rosmerta said, I'll open it for you. I thought you were afraid someone might wander in. She rose and moved to the bar. Even though it was morning, Christmas guests were trickling in. Eno went back to his pie. It was tender and free of any gamey smell. At another table in the hall, a small group of young wizards waited. Draco lounged on a stool with a can of butterbeer. He had already suggested twice that they not wait for Daphne. It was now his third try. Eno, why don't we just go ahead? Daphne's probably held up again. Pansy and Neville sat nearby. They appeared restless, but didn't press. Eno checked the wall clock. They had agreed on 9 o'clock, and it was nearly 10. He was about to agree when green flames flared in the fireplace. Sorry, I'm late. I had to bring a nuisance, someone called. Daphne stepped out, apologizing as usual. Oh, please, I'm not a nuisance. If it weren't for Mum, do you think I'd be tagging along? The fireplace whooshed again, and a girl who could have been Daphne's twin stepped out behind her. Daphne ignored her sister's retort and introduced her. This is my sister, Astoria. I'm sorry, I didn't ask first. She'll probably start at Hogwarts next year. Astoria curtsied and smiled. Hello, I'm very sorry to intrude. I'm Astoria Greengrass. Fate works in curious ways. As she finished, Draco stood to greet her the second he could. Welcome, Draco Malfoy, second-year Slytherin. It was a little presumptuous, since Draco hadn't been the one to arrange the gathering, but it was kept light. Eno rose as well. Welcome, Miss Greengrass. No need to apologize. This is only a small get-together of friends. Later, in a quiet two-story house in Hogsmeade, the small party made itself comfortable. 3 girls sat in the living room chatting and laughing, while Draco and Neville, surprisingly, found a way to talk like old acquaintances. Eno watched the easy peace between them and felt pleased. Draco wasn't a bad person, merely spoiled. After a year and a half of seeing him, Eno had come to his own steady opinion. By noon, the 3 house elves had turned the dining room into a small feast. It turned out 3 of the guests had brought house elves. Not just Draco, but Pansy and Daphne too. After lunch, they moved into afternoon tea, and then the gift exchange. Eno's present was a crystal ball he'd ordered in bulk from Dervish, custom-made. Even with a discount, they'd still cost 9 galleons each. Unlike the one he'd once given Hermione, each of these held a different scene. Neville's contained a tiny, perfect garden. Draco's contained a miniature, fire-breathing Hungarian horntail. Everyone's gift was different, and the others had thought carefully about what to put inside. There was only one awkward moment. Astoria had arrived at the last minute, and he hadn't prepared an extra present. Fortunately, his suitcase still held plenty of sweets. He wrapped some up on the spot and handed them over. Astoria handled it with grace. She didn't fully unwrap the sweets in front of him, allowing both of them to keep a little dignity. At dusk, the afterglow of the setting sun faded, and with it the laughter and warmth of the gathering slipped away. As Draco and Neville left, one after another, the common room returned to its usual hush and chill. On the second floor, in a small bedroom, a bronze candelabra burned on a large wooden desk, its orange-red flame throwing a soft light. Bent over the desk, Eno read a 3-inch thick tome with absorbed attention. It was Miranda Goshawk's Standard Book of Spells, not the pared-down school edition with beginner, intermediate, and advanced labels, but the complete, unexpurgated Standard Book of Spells. Apart from the required omission of the 3 unforgivable curses, it contained almost every other kind of magic. It had been Draco's Christmas present. To be fair, Lucius had been the one to arrange it. When Eno unwrapped it, he was stunned. This unedited edition had apparently scarcely circulated since printing. Even Hogwarts kept it in the restricted section. No wonder he had rushed to open it the moment everyone left. He bent over a sheet of parchment and began to transcribe. While true magical skill favored depth over breadth, some spells simply had to be learned. From the hundreds in the book, he plucked the most practical: the Shield Charm, Disillusionment Charm, Cloud of Mist, Apparition, Healing Charm, and the Undetectable Extension Charm. None were offensive, but they were essential, especially Apparition and the Undetectable Extension Charm, probably the most cost-effective spells a witch or wizard could know. Late into the night, the candelabra burned on. When he finished copying the last spell, Eno closed the book slowly. He felt nervous even putting such a treasure in a suitcase. He only ever felt safe keeping it in the sanctuary. Then, almost as if the room itself approved, he and the books on the desk vanished from the spot. On the morning of the 5th day of the holiday, Eno stood in front of number 282 Hogsmeade, a dilapidated, rickety house. He held the Daily Prophet tightly. An advertisement in the corner of the last page had caught his eye. Porky training, fast spellcasting. Apparition Crash Course. Stable, reliable, efficient. Address. The small ad gave him a weird sense of déjà vu, something like Filch. Still, he had come this far. Other spells were easy enough to learn on his own, but apparition required supervision. Practiced alone, a splinch could be fatal. He knocked carefully, not wanting the fragile door to fall apart. "The door's not locked. Come right in," a rough voice called. Inside, the little room was maybe 10 square meters. Slumped in a chair in the middle sat a broad, middle-aged man in stained, grubby clothes. His skin was weathered, his eyes sunken. He looked more Eastern European than English. "Welcome to Porky training," the man boomed. "Fast spellcasting class, 3 galleons a week. Apparition class, 5 galleons a week. Ministry of Magic certified, no deception." He sounded slurred. Eno noticed the man's reddened eyes and damp shirt. "I'm not drunk, mind," the man went on. 2 bottles of vodka are just an aperitif for breakfast." Hearing vodka reassured Eno. People from that part of the world were often less tolerant of drink, and the comment explained the man's appearance. "I'd like to enroll in the apparition class. You said it's ministry certified?" Eno asked. At the mention of business, the man straightened and shuffled to a nearby cabinet. He was nearly 2 meters tall. A moment later, he produced a certificate stamped with the ministry seal. Eno felt the authenticity of it. The seal's authority matched the one on his own house papers, and his last doubts faded. The place might be shabby, but it was official. The man frowned. "How old are you? If you're under 17, you can't take apparition lessons." "I'm 18, Eno said without hesitation. "Good," the man replied, as if he'd been waiting for that answer. "Pay now and sign the contract. Class starts immediately." He gave his name as Porky. That was all he volunteered. Behind the house was an empty, fenced yard. After paying the 5 galleons, Eno began his lesson there. Porky moved with a slow, measured gait, carrying 2 large bottles of dittany and a handful of markers that looked like little roadblocks. "Whether you know it or not, listen," Porky said, setting the markers around the open space. "There are 3 elements to apparition: a clear destination, unwavering determination, and deliberate action." He placed the markers deliberately, making the training area obvious. "But this is a special crash course. My secret is simple. You focus on the empty space 1 meter away, fix it in your mind, firmly say the spell, and ignore everything else." He set the 2 bottles of dittany where Eno could reach them and regarded him with the weary look of someone who had seen too many splinches. That, and the ministry certificate, were reassurance enough. Eno took a breath, drew his wand, and fixed his gaze on the patch of empty air 1 meter away. "Apparition," he said. Everything went dark for a moment, and then pressure closed in from all sides. It felt as if his lungs were being squeezed, and his body was being forced into a narrow rubber tube and kneaded. He had no sense of time, only the panic of compression. Then, finally, the pressure broke. He was expelled like someone pushed through a bursting balloon. The world snapped back into focus, and the sudden release set his tears and snot running. For several long moments he lay there, trying to steady his breathing and feeling each part of his body return to normal. Porky's gruff voice broke his daze. "Now I believe you're 18. Lesson over. Money's non-refundable, even if it's less than a week." "I learned it just like that," Eno murmured, sitting up. He glanced at the markers and realized his body had indeed appeared at the spot 1 meter away. The fact it had been so simple made it feel unreal. "What else did you expect?" Porky asked with a helpless shrug. "Still, I've been running this place for years. First time I've had someone pick it up so quick. If it's any consolation, I can pop over to Zonko's and get you 2 bundles of fireworks. Don't worry, I'll pay." "No fireworks necessary," Eno said, smiling and shaking his head at Porky's earnestness. "I'll come by every day for an hour to practice for a week. Is that all right?" "Of course," Porky said without hesitation. "I'm here all day. Come whenever you like." The Christmas holiday at Hogwarts lasted the usual 2 weeks and a day, December 21st to January 5th. If the first day back fell on a weekend, the holiday stretched to 17 days. Eno sat in his second-floor room and stared at the brand-new 1993 calendar on his desk. In a daze, the break was already over. Unlike the start of term, when everyone had to take the train, returning from the holidays at Hogwarts was informal. Many pureblood families used home fireplaces to get to Hogsmeade and then walked back to the castle. After watering the sprouted magic beans on his windowsill one last time, Eno packed his things. The fortnight had flown by, but he had no complaints. The gains were worth it. He could apparat reliably now and had successfully cast several other spells, including Protego. The cast still needed refinement, both in quality and speed, especially the undetectable extension charm. His best result so far had simply doubled the volume of a coffee cup. But magic was like that. Once you could cast it, the rest was practice. On January 5th, just before noon, the castle felt unusually quiet. Perhaps the train wasn't due until evening. Outside on the lawn, Eno looked around to make sure no one was nearby, then drew his wand and pointed it at himself. Disillusionment charm. A cool, viscous sensation flowed over his head, as if someone were tipping a basin of chilling water down his shoulders. Even with the White Witch bloodline that made him resistant to cold, he shivered. Gradually, his outline blurred and his body grew transparent. Not true invisibility, the disillusionment charm only rendered him optically indistinct. In dim conditions or at a distance, it would be very hard to spot him. On the outskirts of the forbidden forest, he climbed a tree and tucked his suitcase into a crook of branches, then swept his wand in a defensive arc. Protego. An invisible dome rose overhead like a ceiling, the shield charm acting as his single target defense. Shields were practical. They stopped physical blows and could deflect or blunt many spells. That was why basic proficiency in Protego was one of the Ministry's oral requirements. Still, every charm had its limits, and the strength of a shield came down to the caster. Even Mad-Eye Moody's Protego couldn't hold forever against someone like Voldemort. He hadn't come merely to test a spell, though. He wanted to test sanctuary theory as well. With a one-handed sword in his right hand and his wand in his left, he slipped into the forest. Winter made the forbidden forest bleak. The usual life seemed muted. Trunks and branches looked harsh and skeletal. Eno moved carefully until he came to a cave draped in silk. That wasn't unusual. Spiders preferred sheltered nests for hibernation and eggs, but the place felt wrong. The cave was dozens of square meters and thick with webs, yet there was no sign of the spiders themselves. No scuttling shadows, no rustle of legs. A bottomless tunnel yawned inside, its walls also webbed. He wasn't planning to spelunk into a tunnel today. This trip was practice, not thrill-seeking, so he turned away. A prickle of danger crawled up his spine, and before he could react, something struck him like a motorbike. He went down, tumbling forward, and a chorus of high-pitched squeaks filled the cave. In the instant the impact opened a view, he saw the attacker, a horse-sized spider, thick black fur rippling, 8 pebble-bright eyes glinting with animal cunning. A juvenile, by Acromantula standards. Adults could span up to 15 feet across, as big as a small bus. The ambush hadn't broken his Protego, so he wasn't panicked. He grabbed his dropped sword and lunged. The cave turned into a blur of silk and thrusts. Despite its bulk, the young Acromantula was terrifyingly agile, scaling webbed walls and darting between strands as if it were the most natural thing. After 7 or 8 minutes of trading blows, he'd been knocked down 3 times and had barely nicked it. One fortunate slash had mangled a foreleg, but otherwise the spider remained uninjured and lively. He lowered his sword slowly. Sectum sempra. There was no flourish of light, but the effect was brutal and immediate. The spider froze, then its huge body cleaved down the middle, falling apart along with the webs behind it. Even as it died, its pebble eyes held a look of confusion. Eno crouched and pulled a prepped glass vial from his pocket. He had worked with Snape enough to know the value of rare potions' ingredients. Acromantula venom was pricey because it was scarce. The yield from a horse-sized spider was only a few dozen milliliters at most. He capped the vial and methodically began to tidy the site, then resumed his search. In a hidden nook against the cave wall, he found what he'd been hoping for, a silk cocoon the size of a wash basin. Inside were a dozen quail egg-sized spider eggs and a handful of translucent spiderlings. He lifted the cocoon gently and, with a thought, vanished from the cave. Sanctuary. The private space he'd carved out opened up, a 4-foot-wide, chilled corridor, another sheltered place where he could study his finds safely. He set the wash basin-sized cocoon on the path and squatted beside it. The translucent spiderlings had already died when he brought them in. The eggs, however, were alive. More than that, faint threads of connection seemed to link the eggs to each other, and to him in a way he hadn't expected. Patterns and impressions flickered through his mind: submission, obedience, trust. It felt less like language and more like emotion translated into thought. The unusual resonance hinted that his little miracle, whatever had enabled his earlier bond experiments, might be working on these embryos as well. "This just keeps getting more interesting," he murmured, staring at the dozen eggs. Adult, embryo, birth. The idea of control washed through him like a tide. He felt absolute, terrifying potential. Xiaodi had kept his promise. He'd worked from 7 in the morning until 7 at night and was exhausted. Today he'd suspend the sharing session. They'd continue introducing new magical creatures tomorrow. Right now, he didn't want to move. The afterglow of sunset spilled across the black lake, gold light dancing on the ripples. Eno sat by the water in a small reclining chair he'd had made for himself, a delicate fishing rod in his hand, his eyes fixed on the bobber. When the bobber suddenly jerked, a flash of pleasure crossed his face. He lifted the rod, yanked back, and a silver fish arced through the air, landing on the bank. He didn't bother to stand and unhook it. He watched the fish flop. Beside his chair, an open suitcase lay ready. In an instant, 20 or so fist-sized acromantulas spilled out, lining up and swarming the fish. 10 seconds later, only a clean skeleton remained. Eno raised the rod in his left hand and flicked his wand with his right. A plump, wriggling earthworm appeared on the hook, transfigured bait. He cast again and waited. Then, with a snap of his fingers, the spiders retreated into the suitcase. Only the largest acromantula, its fur flecked with blue, stayed on the ground. It hopped lightly and settled on his knee. "Back in, boys. You can come out when there's a fish on the hook," Eno murmured, running a hand over the blue leader. A brief, obedient thought passed to him, and the spider hopped down and trotted toward the suitcase. Adult acromantulas, able to speak and as intelligent as humans, kept strict hierarchies. That blue giant had been the leader of the 20 spiders a moment ago. He kept his gaze on the bobber and let his mind wander. It had been more than 2 months since Christmas. The castle had mostly settled back into routine. People no longer gossiped about Lockhart. His arrest by the ministry and his inevitable Wizengamot trial had made his downfall unavoidable. The castle's restlessness had quieted, but a subtle uncertainty lingered beneath the surface. Valentine's Day was approaching, but Eno did not care for Lockhart or for roses and chocolates. What occupied him was the miracle inside the sanctuary. The acromantula eggs in the sanctuary had hatched. He now had 23 obedient, responsive young spiders that took his commands. But that seemed to be the limit. Over the past 2 months, he had tried every experiment he could think of: other magical creature eggs, ordinary eggs, even insect eggs, yet none of them reacted as the acromantula eggs had. They felt dead, as if the sanctuary gave them no life. Still, he had theories. If his deduction was correct, then when he eventually entered the larger, more fantastic world, he wouldn't be able to travel there at will. He would have to consider other possibilities. Time passed. After the next handful of catches, the lake fell silent. For over an hour, the bobber didn't so much as twitch. The fish in the black lake seemed to have learned to ignore transfigured earthworms. "Next time, I'll find live bait," Eno muttered, undoing the transfiguration on his gear and picking up the suitcase. The sanctuary was cold and snowed over. The acromantulas, once inside, could only semi-hibernate. The suitcase was their reluctant nest. As he walked across the castle lawn, he glanced toward the stone house in the distance. Still Hagrid's hut. Now that the sanctuary seemed to host only one species, Eno found himself thinking of Rubus Hagrid, the castle's resident expert on magical creatures. Hagrid's experiments, crossing a manticore with a fire crab to breed the blast-ended scroot, were the kind of impossible tinkering most people couldn't imagine pulling off. Mid-February. The Scottish chill was easing, and the castle's mood warmed with it. In the Gryffindor girls' dormitory, Hermione Granger clutched her sheet and scowled as her roommates chattered eagerly. They were all genteel on the surface, but when left to themselves, they spoke freely. And today they were at it again, swooning over Eno, how his washed-out hair and deep eyes were suddenly more compelling, how since last year he carried himself with a new nobility. Hermione felt her face heat. Even putting herself in their place, she found the talk awkward. That did not mean she had to listen to it. "Parvati, can you help me?" she called. The girls' dormitory had split into factions, 4 cliques and 6 beds, and Parvati Patil, the representative of the neutral group, answered. Everyone's chatter stuttered and slowed. Admittedly, they all wanted to see what Hermione, the one who pretended to be above such things, might say. "I'm here, Hermione," Parvati said, coming to her bed. "What is it?" "Can you get my trunk down from the shelf? It's too high and it's heavy. We'll have to do it together." Hermione kicked off her slippers and stood barefoot on the bed, deliberately ignoring spells and the levitation charm. 2 minutes later, Parvati held the trunk open. "It's gorgeous. I've never seen anything like it in Diagon Alley. Did he have it custom made?" she exclaimed. Hermione's voice rose half a decibel. She had been waiting for that reaction. "He gave it to me at Christmas. Maybe he bought it in Hogsmeade. After all, he lives there." She didn't bother to look at them while she added, "I saw the shop last summer. It's a beautiful little 2-story house." Parvati smiled inwardly. She realized she'd been used as a prop, but she didn't mind. Neutrality came with being useful now and then, and watching the dormitory come alive again pleased her. The conversation stirred back into life. Gossip, guesses, and the excited plotting of girls with too much idle time and too many imaginations.